In today's video, I'll be covering the least famous member of the Kido Butai. That ship was Sōryū. She tends to get overlooked a bit in comparison to the others, through no fault of the ship or her crew, but simply because the other carriers are far better known. So in this video, we'll look at Sōryū's story, starting with some quirky choices in her initial design process, something that becomes more understandable when you realize her position. Sōryū was the first purpose-designed fleet carrier that the Japanese ever built. Before her, there was only Akagi and Kaga, both of which were conversions, and the far smaller Hosho and Ryūjō. So Sōryū is in the same position as USS Ranger across the Pacific, with much the same, no one really knows what they want out of this design process, resulting in some curious design choices, to put things mildly. There's not a lot of detail on these designs, but we do have some drawings, including in warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Those drawings were recreated in Shipbucket, and I'll put them on screen here, both the book and the website versions. First, you have design G6 of 1932, with a relatively short flight deck and 3 turrets mounted on the bow. A cruiser-carrier hybrid, leaning more towards carrier than cruiser. This design did not come about from a vacuum. On the one hand, the Japanese had already stuck what amounted to cruiser turrets on Akagi and Kaga's original 3-layer design. But in this case, G6 was actually a direct response to some interesting wording in the London Naval Treaty, relating to cruisers with flight decks. Specifically, that no more than a quarter of a signatory's cruiser tonnage could have a flight deck, or anything related to it, like a flying-off platform or a landing platform. And that fitting of a flight deck did not, in fact, make a cruiser into a carrier. I could probably crack a joke here about World of Warships and their matchmaker being broken by hybrid battleships, and how they don't count as carriers. But that aside, this wording was put in by request of the Americans. Not surprising, because various flavors of flight deck cruiser would keep being proposed over the 1930s. They never went anywhere, but American designers had the strangest obsession with the idea for a very long time. In any event, the Japanese picked up on this and correctly assumed this is what was going on. Thus, you get G6 as a counter to these hypothetical American ships. A counter that would also end up abandoned for various reasons, mostly related to stability concern, but also a desire to have a more dedicated carrier on the same tonnage, which resulted in the second preliminary design, G8. This had a full-length flight deck along with a different superstructure design in both the island and the vertical funnel, something that wouldn't really pop up on Japanese carriers again until Hio and Taiho. That aside, G8 still retained some quirks, most notably 2 cruiser-scale turrets under the bow flight deck, something that would doom this design in the aftermath of the Tomozuru incident. In simplest terms, a torpedo boat capsizing in rough weather, specifically because the ship was severely overloaded and of questionable stability. This forced the Japanese to take a hard look at their navy, both built and being designed. And someone pointed out that trying to cram cruiser guns on a fleet carrier was not the best idea, especially when that carrier was supposed to be closer in tonnage to a treaty cruiser, rather than something like Akagi or Kaga. So design G8 originating in 1933 with the Tomozuru incident in 1934, was dropped as well, replaced by design G9, which would ultimately become Sōryū. So with all of that covered, let's look at that final design. Sōryū displaced 16,200 tons at her standard displacement. That rose up to 19,100 tons at the normal loading. On that displacement, the ship came out to 227 meters or 746 feet in length, with a beam of 21 meters or just under 70 feet. The flight deck, meanwhile, was 217 meters or 711 feet long, and 26 meters or 85 feet wide, with 3 elevators and a starboard side island. In addition, following typical Japanese fashion, Sōryū also had 2 hangars, an upper hangar of 171 meters in length and 18 meters in width, or 562 feet long and 60 feet wide, with a smaller lower hangar coming out to 142 meters or 467 feet long. The width was the same. This is also something you see on British carriers. All of this supported an air wing that varied in size depending on the time frame or source. Warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy cite 71 aircraft between active use and spares. As of Pearl Harbor, Sōryū carried 63 active and 9 reserve aircraft, 72 in all, split between 21 Zeros, 18 D-3A Val dive bombers, and a further 18 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. As for defensive weaponry, Sōryū carried 6 twin 127mm or 5-inch dual-purpose gun mounts, 12 barrels in all, joined by 14 twin 25mm mounts or 28 barrels, with further defense provided by a 41mm 1.6-inch thick splinter belt over the ship's magazines, all of which was carried through the water at around 34 knots by 152,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts in this case. And with that rounding off Sōryū's design and design process, we can move on to her service history. This story began on November 20th, 1934. Sōryū, meaning Blue Dragon, or alternatively Green Dragon, was laid down in Kure, with the ship launched on December 23rd, 1935, and then commissioned on December 29th, 1937, a pretty standard construction period for that time. Once commissioned, her initial service was quiet. Sōryū worked her crew up and conducted final trials, including sailing to China in April 1938. Once there, some of her air wing was flown ashore to support offensives. This group of planes and pilots would spend a couple months in China traveling with various Japanese offensives, before eventually returning to the ship on July 10, 1938. During this period, Sōryū also finished her own working up. She would spend a couple tours off China in late 1938, before spending 1939 and 1940 on more typical training duty, along with the odd and mostly uneventful tour off China. This would continue into 1941, with the most excitement coming in July with the occupation of French Indochina. Then it was back to Japan for more dock work. After a final refit that ended in October 1941, Sōryū began preparing for the attack on Pearl Harbor. This would see the carrier depart with the rest of the Kido Butai on November 26, 1941, consisting of 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Sōryū, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the greatest single concentration of carrier air power to that date. Now, considering how famous this attack is, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Sōryū arrived with the rest of the Kido Butai off Hawaii on the morning of December 7th, 1941, December 8th on the Japanese side of the dateline. The carrier would send her aircraft up in the first wave a little after 6 a.m. that morning. Sōryū contributed 8 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and then more B-5Ns armed with bombs, along with 8 Zeros on escort. The torpedo bombers were supposed to attack the American carriers. As those weren't present, Sōryū's pilots attacked other targets, among others Helena, Raleigh, and the ex-battleship Utah. The level bombers attacked the battleships on Battleship Row, while the Zeros strafed the airfields. In the second wave, Sōryū contributed 18 D-3A Val dive bombers and 9 Zeros, although one of those Vals had to return due to engine trouble. Exactly which targets they hit isn't entirely clear. Throughout both waves, Sōryū lost 3 Zeros and 2 Vals. None of the Kates, however. After the second wave, the Japanese forces withdrew. It's during the return to Japan that Sōryū's story diverges from the rest of the Kido Butai, along with Hiryu. Those 2 ships were detached on December 16th, 1941, to help with the invasion of Wake Island. The Marine defenders were quite stubborn and had actually caused notable damage to Japanese invasion forces, including the first Japanese warship lost to American aircraft, the destroyer Kisaragi, soon after the loss of Hayate to shore batteries. As a result, on December 21st, Hiryu and Sōryū began to launch raids on Wake Island. This would continue through to December 23rd, when the Japanese sent their forces ashore. With the surrender of Wake on the 23rd, however, Sōryū continued to Japan. She arrived there on December 29th and went in for routine maintenance and resupply. This would last until January 12th, 1942, when Sōryū was sent to the South Pacific, specifically the Dutch East Indies. The carrier would arrive in that general area on January 23rd, launching airstrikes on Ambon Island off the coast of New Guinea. Well, attempting to. Bad weather called off the strike on the 23rd, with a replacement attack launched the next day. After this, Sōryū set off for Palau to await Akagi and Kaga. She did put some aircraft ashore before this, with those planes supporting the invasion of Borneo. As for Sōryū, her next action only came in February 1942. On February 19th specifically, when she participated in the raid on Darwin, Australia. When the attack concluded, after 2 waves, Sōryū departed the area. She would continue to support operations in the East Indies through to March, including a famous incident on March 1st, 1942. Her aircraft helped sink the oiler USS Pecos, and soon after that, they helped in the sinking of the destroyer USS Etzel. Exactly which carrier's aircraft crippled that destroyer is debatable. It might have been Sōryū's pilots, it might not. Either way, with Etzel's sinking, Sōryū shifted to land attack. This period of supporting land operations would last through March 10th, ranging as far as Christmas Island on March 7th. The rest of that month would be generally quiet, until on March 26th, Sōryū joined a much longer range operation, the Indian Ocean Raid of April 1942. Sōryū's aircraft would strike British targets from April 5th through April 10th, 1942. It would also prove to be Sōryū's last combat operation before the Battle of Midway. The carrier left the Indian Ocean and returned to Japan by April 22nd of 1942. She would spend some time in routine maintenance before leaving on May 27th. This would, as it turned out, end in Sōryū's destruction. She joined the rest of the Kido Butai, aside from Shokaku and Zuikaku. The Japanese forces sailed for Midway, arriving off that island on June 4th, 1942. The first phase of this action came in air raids on Midway itself, followed later on by attacks on the Japanese by American land-based aircraft. Those raids were failures, with both torpedo attacks and level bombing resulting in no hits. Sōryū in particular was targeted by B-17s, leading to some of the few pictures we have of this ship. She continued to evade damage during the following torpedo attacks, with VT-8's bombers failing to land any hits, at the cost of the entire squadron. However, if you know anything about the Battle of Midway, you know where this is going. While the torpedo bombers were being shot down, the dive bombers were approaching. And at 10:25 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, they struck Sōryū. Dauntlesses from USS Yorktown dove on the carrier. 3 direct hits, each 1,000-pound bombs, struck Sōryū. These detonated in her hangar spaces, where planes were being refueled and rearmed. The secondary explosions and resulting fires doomed the ship, and wiped out a large portion of the crew. If anything, she was the worst hit of the Japanese carriers. Sōryū lost power by 10:40, and 5 minutes later, the crew was ordered to abandon ship as the fires raged out of control. Survivors were plucked from the water by the destroyers Izokaze and Hamikaze. Sōryū, meanwhile, remained stubbornly afloat, ablaze and certainly damaged beyond repair, but still afloat because aircraft carriers can be remarkably stubborn. As a result, Izokaze scuttled Sōryū with torpedoes, with the carrier sinking around 7:15 p.m. on June 4th. 711 of the crew went down with the ship, including the majority of the men in the engineering spaces and hangars. With only 1,003 men aboard to begin with, that's the highest loss percentage of any of the Japanese carriers. As Sōryū went under, a large underwater explosion was reported. Her wreck has yet to be discovered, but between the fires and that explosion, I'm not expecting a very intact wreck. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.